Now we are talking on this panel about how to make games work. And I'm Bobby Brill, and I am the host of Creative Mind here at the Academy of Art. And we've got Greg Eichholzer, who leads the UI UX track here at the Academy, and Ryan Bowder, who's a UX designer. And we're going to talk about the mysterious world of UI and UX. And Greg and Ryan have a lot of experience in this and can walk us through this really interesting world that has how you push buttons and psychology and how things are designed and why you do the things you do and how people train you to do the things you do. Greg, so set us up. What is UI and UX?
Broadly, you can define UI UX by the terms, right? Like user interface and user experience design. So, user interface being a surface or anything that you interact with. In terms of games, that could be the PlayStation 5 controller coming soon, right? Or that could be the phone on your mobile device, touch screen. You have to consider the surface that you're playing with as part of it. It's how you're interacting with a device, user interface.
And this is, and just to clarify, this is not just video games that uses UI UX. Pretty much every piece of technology, UI and UX is a major part of it, correct? I mean, how you use a remote control, where the buttons are on your washing machine, this is all part of this concept, correct?
Right, like even your keyboard on your computer is user interface, right? Like if you have to touch it or communicate through it or with it, that's probably a piece of user interface involved there.
Yeah, I think it goes beyond any one industry. The interesting thing with UX design is, it's product design as well. There's so many layers of this here, and it's the psychology of how people are interacting with something and the compulsions that drive that behavior, the motivation. So there's always a way to kind of action that, the interface itself, the visuals of that, the style of that, and then this kind of like, where do we place those things and why? What are we trying to accomplish with those? And that's kind of a philosophical level, like 1,000-foot view of kind of the differences between UI and UX from a discipline, a domain perspective. So there's a lot of like nuance of the deliverables and the actions that happen, but those are kind of broad buckets of ownership.
Right. So from how I understand it, right? Like user experience, very much concerned with the function and how the thing is put together and works. Where UI art is, what does it look like, and how does it make you feel to look at it, right? What would you say about that?
Yeah, I think really broadly that's true. And I think the interesting thing, at least from a business perspective and from a kind of the reality of how this all works, is that UI, although it is about the visuals of it, it has a direct impact on the perceived usability and the UX of the product. So there's a really tight kind of collaboration between these two disciplines. For example, in kind of my work, we do define them as different domains more often than not, but it is a hybrid role as well, and those types of lenses on the product or what's valuable on kind of illuminating how someone is going to be interacting and working with a different game or product or whatever. So, we got some examples here. UX is often looking at kind of like architecturally what we're trying to do, the defining of documentation of how do we accomplish this? How does someone communicate this to the next person in line? UI is often that person. But the part that is more kind of scientific, and this is where UX kind of bridges the creative and kind of analytical worlds, is you're doing a lot of analysis and validation and testing. So you're always trying to not just design from your own necessarily experiences and hunches. You're trying to suss out what is best for your particular users, which are going to be unique in every product and every game. They're going to change. You could build the same match 3 game 100 times, but your audience is probably going to shift based on IP, based on genre, based on the UI style. You might even shift around who is affinity to this. And so the ultimate goal of UX is kind of the synthesis of psychology data and motivations, and then translating that into something that can be taken to the next level of detail, which is the UI visual style, that collaboration with UX to translate it. So yeah, that's kind of philosophically how I look at the high level role.
Right. So you kind of function as like an architect of the interactions, where the UI artist is kind of handling the landscaping and interior design.
Yeah, to a large degree, I think that makes sense to me.
Yeah, 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 it's really interesting. I mean, they're definitely related, and you can't. I don't feel like you could have an effective user experience without both sides of this coin. I think function, without form, feels bland, but form without function is not really useful.
Well, can you guys give us an example of that? Like, what would be an example of bad UI UX? And we don't have to pick on anybody, but because I'm sure there's a lot, and you'll probably have your favorite badges of shame you've seen. But what are some examples of stuff that just hasn't worked, where you think about and go, wow, that the UI and the UX just failed? And it doesn't have to be something in video games, but just to give people an idea of what bad is, so we know what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic for me because for me, when I look at UX, it's more of a process than an outcome necessarily. It's about how we get to good. And so I'm very slow. I will still answer this question, but I'm very slow to define something as bad without knowing the context and the constraints they were within. Because UX is kind of this triangle of needs where you've got the business outcomes, the business goals. You got to make money or whatever you're trying to do, sell ads, whatever it is. You've got the technical feasibility of it all. Can you even implement it? Do you have the time to do it? What's your production schedule like? And then you've got usability, just as a broad concept. And you're going to compromise on all of these to a degree over time. Business goals might overrule a UX concern around surfacing of the monetization system, because they really feel like it's valuable from a product perspective to have a pop-up that says buy this thing. And there's always these compromises and constraints. You're looking for the best solution within those borders, those barriers. And so I'm just caveating it because I don't want to call out anything in particular. But there's, for me, the bad UX is usually where you can tell that there's been a lack of thought on the holistic connections of a product. And looking at games in particular, you start seeing fractured paradigms of interaction. So you tap a button and it brings up a pop-up when first time you tap it, and on a different screen, the same exact button is there. You tap it up and it brings in a transition into a full screen modal, and you can't press back on that one to bring you back to the previous place because the architecture is broken. Those are when I start questioning the process that got them there. There's fragmentation, and for me, the big goal of UX is to build confidence in a user so that they want to press something. They know that if they do this, they are safe and they're going to have fun. It's going to do what they want to do. And so those are the little kind of death by a thousand cuts that for me make bad UX, because you're going to just chip away at that user's confidence. And eventually they're not going to want to buy. They aren't going to trust your payment flow. They're not going to trust your game. So that's how I've defined most of the bad UX when I see it. Is those little moments that build.
Yeah, that actually brings me to one of my guiding principles that I've been training and teaching my students through some mnemonic things, but reliability, right? Like, you build reliability, and I really like what Ryan's talking about, user confidence. You boost user confidence by using design principles like repetition, which can be visual repetition. It can be repetition in an animation or a color or a shape, and you train the player that a particular button is going to do the same thing whether you hit it on on one screen or you hit it on another, it should have the same outcome. And that repetition builds the reliability that I feel like, inspires confidence. It's it's kind of crazy, like how how those things work.
Well, I mean that brings up that idea. I mean, and that might be a simple answer. If you ever used a piece of software or a piece of hardware, and every time you go to use it, you're just like, ugh. All right, how do I do this again? What was the way? I think I got to do that. If you're thinking that, that's kind of the first step into you've made bad UX or bad UI.
Oh,
This is bad. This is not giving me. This is not motivating me to use this product again.
I mean, a lot of it is kind of personal to a degree. I think like what's necessarily bad to me may not be bad to somebody else.
Well, and that brings up the great point of kind of like you're designing for a specific user, so you've got to know your users, and it's not there's this just foundational, it's overused, but it's a great trope in UX, which is you are not the user, and it doesn't matter how close you are to the product. It doesn't matter if you are the gamer that plays every Fortnite battle royale type game. If you're building one, you're still not your user. You need to understand what their needs are. There's a lot of classic examples on the UX forums where someone will post this interface that's just a mess of options and stuff. And it's for generally a specific purpose. And I'm like, I bet if you interview people that used it, they might have a different opinion than you looking at this from the outside, because their needs might be getting matched by this interface. And that's why this thing has been successful. And that's why it's still around. It doesn't mean it's not bad. There might be improvements, but like the outcome needs to be catered to that audience, not to your perception of good usability. And that's where the UX science side comes in to try to help validate and support that, where you try to test out, vet out, ensure that you're understanding that your users in your context that you're trying to design for.
Like to just kind of wrap that up, it's like a game designed for someone who's 5 to 8 years old may not be the most successful design for somebody who's 18 to 36, right? Like those are two very different.
45-year-old who's using a video game for the first time in 20 years, saying, that makes sense that you're thinking about your user.
Right. So this brings me to a point where I want to share another slide about some key terminology we kind of all have to have or understand as when we're thinking in terms of user interface and user experience in games. We need to be aware of and really understand the game design document. Right. So this is typically a document that comes from the game designer on the project. They usually have some objective or mechanic in the gameplay that they're outlining the function of. And, from my point of view as a UI artist, that would give me a list of various objects or buttons or frames or lists that I'm going to have to put a visual style on. Ryan, what does a game design document do, or how does a user experience designer use a game design document?
Yeah, we leverage them as kind of a list of goals and outcomes. They have something they want to build. They want to drive X behavior in a player, and they've outlined or detailed a way to accomplish that. And so our goals with that is to sit down with a designer and discuss intent, discuss nuance, ensure that we understand their design well. This is often done through Google, Docs and comments and things, but the main goal is to find their core intent and to define the level of complexity that they're expecting. So we'll list out the number of rewards they're expecting to be given on the screen, the number of variables that they're probably going to have, the general scale of the system. We'll try to define there through either information architecture mapping or other means. And ultimately, this is our blueprint for the next phase of our design exploration. We'll get to that later, but this is kind of the foundation where we can quickly align as a team on the core intent of what we're trying to accomplish with this feature.
Yeah, so it's important.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, for me now, we actually split this typically into a little more phases than just a single document. You know, we have a one pager, or basically a pitch that's intentionally short, that is there to give general alignment. That goes into a midterm spec. There's 1,000 terms for this, and that has the general architecture they're expecting, some of the scale, and then there's the full design spec, whatever you want to call that, and that goes into details of live operability, of complexity, of excuse me, of 2 years down the line, the kind of like growth plan, the scale we're expecting. So like you've got this tiered approach to getting alignment and moving, and then I look at UX as a continuation of that. So we're contributing to one of these steps. At the early stages, we're looking at, well, what feature are we building? Should we be going and looking at competitors that have built similar features? Should we be taking those into the lab and looking at what is performing well? What did their players think is great about this? What do they not? At maybe the medium stage, we start providing sketching, and we start providing some more detail for them, as the visuals that we all know, the visual side of things is easier for a lot of people to understand than, say, just a bunch of words. I've had game design documents be 200 pages. Not everyone can read that and parse that and understand what this is. So we start contributing, architectural UX, maybe some more of the here's a general layout. We don't know all the details yet, but this could be like this. And then the final stage is I typically, this is very personal, I like to break out the UX entirely from the game design document, and we delivered UX documentation through Wireflow style document. I'll kind of cover this later. I don't want to get too down the rabbit hole. And then, of course, at different stages here, you can be prototyping and doing other ways to try to illuminate the problem. That's really UX's goal, is to help communicate. You're trying to illuminate, take away layers, make it more clear at every step, so that other stakeholders can be confident in moving forward. And that confidence can be built from testing, or it could be built from just internal alignment. There's a dozen ways to get more confidence, and this is a kind of UX's goal.
Right. So, yeah, making the experience, one, easier for the player that it's intended for, and fun, right? Like it still needs to satisfy that need of fun in the game. So objective, right? Like every screen that you're interacting with should have a clear objective, like knowing what the most important action is on a particular screen, so the player doesn't feel lost. Some other terms that we need to kind of cover, and Ryan started talking about this. Wire flow is another term similar to wireframe. Wireframe being a very bare bones graphic layout for how an interaction in a game should work.
And 9 times out of 10, this is what people think of when they think of UX. There's nothing wrong with that, but it is a very narrow view of this stripped down grayscale. We're removing all color and all superfluous information to focus on architecture and interaction, and that's UX to people.
Just it's the function before the form, right? Typography is another thing that we've got to be very aware of with user interface, and I still feel that it's important for someone in user experience to have control over, because this is, we're trained, through reading and learning that, and visually, like how you treat your typography, what pieces of information are most important first, right? That's why we have like headlines versus subheads and body copy. That difference, and understanding some typography will help you direct someone's vision in order to read the most important information in the order that you want.
And couple that with accessibility concerns from a UX standpoint. How legible are things? Are you able to translate this into other language? Localization for games is massive. So are you able to go into Russian? Are you able to go into Asian characters? Are you able to do all those in this? Do you need a second font? Are you able to validate those things because you don't know the language? Like, there's a lot of complexity with typography that is very difficult, and it's really a form and function kind of marriage at all times. There's no one owner of that because they're so intimately connected.
Something that a lot of my students get really excited about early on is like, I'm gonna, draw a really beautiful headline for this screen. Like, I'm gonna hand draw the letters and do all this stuff, and then I love asking this question. So what happens when you've got to translate that into Italian, German, Spanish, French, Russian, and are you ready to draw that a few more times? Oh, yes. So yeah, like typography and understanding, that you'll need to make sure the choices that you make with the letter forms that you're picking are going to impact the pipeline, or could impact the pipeline. Positive and negative reinforcement. All right, so Ryan, how important is it from user experience standpoint that we're aware of what positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement are?
I think broadly, this goes back to our kind of foundational confidence stuff. Like, this is incredibly formative to a player's kind of desires to come back and to even re-engage with this. So yeah, I think they're both incredibly powerful tools, and they can be used very poorly by products that don't understand the kind of complexity of this. I think that for me, or not for me, I think from a psychology perspective, players will remember a more negative experience much more powerfully than a positive, unfortunately. So you're looking to mitigate those and trying to, even in moments with games, you have death, you have times you need to respawn, you failed a thing. So understanding what will capture that re-engagement loop and the desire to continue, and what motivates those actions is really powerful. So negative isn't always bad in the sense of like the player just being wrong or they're being punished, but it can be something that can be interpreted as bad. And so figuring out the ways to capture those moments correctly, and I wouldn't even say spin them to positive, but ensure that you're capturing their ability to do the action better the next time. If that's a teachable moment, if that's whatever it is, you're always trying to find those areas.
So these are kind of like tools that we need to use to teach the player how to play the game.
Yeah, for sure. That's a big component of it.
Cool. So
that's kind of an odd thing to throw out there, where it's you're making video games teach, which is kind of a funny thing to say, but it kind of again that just to kind of put a pin in that, or I'm sure you're going to talk about it more, but that there's a lot. It seems like there's a huge amount of psychology and training and getting into people's minds and pulling them along with you with the typography and the wireframing. It seems beyond what most people think about when they go, I'm going to make a video game.
Definitely. I mean, for me at least, when it comes to UX and games, like the way we look at UX is similar to the way we look at teaching, honestly. Like your documentations are like lesson plans, and you're catering those lesson plans to your students that you are trying to teach a certain thing to. And so if a player doesn't understand how to be successful in your game, they will not play your game. The goals that they need to accomplish, and they don't need to be winning, but the goals that they need to accomplish to be doing well, to be making progress, whatever that is, need to be clearly defined and taught, because they're not always going to be explicit. I've made games with incredibly dense kind of gameplay mechanics that you're never going to learn right away, but we can breadcrumb a user over time, revealing layers of complexity on how they're supposed to accomplish these. And if you do it well, you will keep the majority of them, or a large number, whatever you're, with you as you go on this journey. And so it really is you are teaching. It's one of the hardest parts of games is the tutorialization / just onboarding. Like, how do you make a player understand what they're intention is, what their goals are, what you're trying to have them do. Do they want to do that? Are you aligned? So again, that's all that testing and validation and research and interviewing. We'll get to some of this again at the end, but like those are all really, really powerful, because if you don't know your players, if you don't understand what their personalities are, their goals are, how they play, you might not be able to craft that experience for them in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I mean, this is like another one of those guiding principles that we've talked about, previously, like empathy, right? Like having empathy for the player, being able to communicate to the audience appropriately. Again, where the game designer, their goal is to set up the mechanic and figure out what that core fun experience is. Our job is to make sure that the rule book is easy to understand and feels good and works correctly for that particular audience.
So then what are some of the tools then that a UI UX artist should start thinking about or being familiar with if they want to succeed?
Right. So we've got this list here of different tools for a UI UX artist or designer. Among them, some really industry standard tools, Photoshop and Illustrator, for sure. Those come into great use when you're creating the graphics and the UI art and drawing skill, right? Like if you're creating UI art, you're still going to need those foundational drawing skills and art and graphic design skills. There are areas that are more important for user experience versus what's important tools wise than just being a UI artist. So what we have in bold here are some of the crossover skills, right? Understanding some wireframing software. This is certainly important, I feel, for UI artists to be aware of and able to use, but these are more important for someone doing user experience design. Ryan, what skills do you feel user experience people need the most?
Yeah, I think from just a tooling perspective, you're always gonna have a wireframing tool of choice. And if you're doing kind of pure UX, so there's no real crossover with your kind of execution of the UI. Sketch, XD, Figma, those are the kind of industry standards right now. Honestly, though, I've had designers use Illustrator, I've had them use Balsamic, and I have kind of a philosophy on tools, which is use the tool you're fastest on to communicate as well as you can. Like, there's no reason to get fancy. There's no reason you need to pay a huge license for something. If you're able to effectively communicate with sketches and your team can work off of that, fine. I've never had a team that can do just sketches, just for context. But the goal really here is to be able to visualize this architecture, these concepts well and quickly. And UX is built on an iterative cycle of design work. So you're not trying to hit a home run on the first pass. You're trying to illuminate the problem space and then dig into ways to solve it. And so that's where the prototyping comes in heavily, as we're finding more and more the connection of kind of interaction design, motion design, and UX. There's an intimate kind of connection. So some of the tools I've listed out here, kind of like Principal, Framer, and Flinto in particular, they have they're much closer to like Flash in a lot of ways, where they have timelines, they have ways to move objects very easily. They're very simple to get out of the box, especially if you come from a creative background. I guess using Flash as a reference is probably getting very dated. I need to update that. But the goal here again is to communicate. You're communicating the interaction, you're communicating the movement, you're communicating the reinforcement. So you're always using these to communicate, which kind of leads to the one that's in the yellow. This is by far for kind of both groups, the ability to communicate is just foundational. So like you're not trying to win the Design of the Year award as a UX designer. You're not trying to prove how smart you are as the UX guy. Ego should have nothing to do with your work. You're trying to communicate the goals of so many other people and facilitate that to a place that can be implemented in a realistic function in the timelines you have. You're going to keep talking about this. Like Those are all of the main goals. So how you get to that clarity is kind of up to you, but typically you're going to be using these wireframing and prototyping tools in some capacity to help dig down into those. And we don't list it here, but there's some other nice skills for UX designers, like the ability to do your own SQL queries and understand data. Do you understand some of those kind of KPI driven things? They're nice to have in the future of your goals, but they aren't kind of necessarily the foundational things that these are here. So I'm going to stop tangenting here because I'm going to get confusing. But this is more of the kind of core skills.
So you mentioned something. Can you explain what KPI is?
Oh, let's see if I can. Key performance indicators, I believe. I actually have no idea what half the acronyms I say actually mean. I just know what they mean in context. But they are basically business goals. But they can also be behavioral goals. They can be, we want players to interact with this screen once a day. Are we getting them there? Are they accomplishing a 15 match wins a day? That doesn't necessarily translate into more money or retention per se, but they generally have a correlation, So we're looking at ways to define behavior that leads to outcomes. So, we know if players play for 1 hour a day, they're likely to retain it, blah, blah, blah. Something like this is the hypothesis. So then you're developing systems in mind with that goal of trying to keep people in the game satisfied, having fun, engaged for X amount of time because you found whatever outcome is positive for them, which is generally going to be retention, or maybe they monetize better, or maybe they rate the product at a higher level of satisfaction, which you're gathering through surveys or whatever. So you're trying to measure something and then validate if you've hit those goals. That's the kind of base idea of KPIs. So typically you're going to be looking at retention. You're going to look at like tutorial completions. You're going to look at how much money are we making a month. Those are the base ones, but there's a lot more nuance you can get into from the UX world around behavior and motivations and how to drive players into, and how to analyze if you're accomplishing that drive into these different systems.
So there's some science and analysis involved in the user experience side that maybe the user interface artist is probably not as involved with.
Probably doesn't need to be day to day, but I think you and I chatted about this a good amount. Like, and we'll get to it at the end. I don't want to jump the gun too much, but I feel like these types of things are they're always shared to a large degree. I never want to have a UX person feel like they're the knowledge expert and they own that piece of information. It should be something that's part of the DNA of a team, because you're all ultimately responsible for the user experience. You're all going to affect it. And I can't remember if we mentioned this earlier, but the visual style, the quality of the UI, the perception of that quality directly impacts the perceived usability of something. So there's no siloing of this, regardless of, I look at UX and UI as separate functions in my business, but that's because I think the collaboration between the two is incredibly powerful. Having people who can focus on each problem separately and then help challenge each other to get to an ultimate, better quality goal is always the big thing. So yeah, I think going back to data and the KPI analysis and all that stuff, it's super important to internalize and to really understand the nuance there, and to know how to dig into it yourself is great, but you don't necessarily need to be a SQL expert to do that. You can learn ways to get there.
Yes, I think you said something really, really important that stuck out to me, that the UX person shouldn't be the owner of that knowledge, right? Like that.
The sole
this
owner.
Right. Like that it takes the whole team to make something usable and fun and compelling. I think that's really important to think about, because you can't make a good interface in a vacuum. You need to have people playing the game, and you need to have that kind of feedback. These are some more important terms when it comes to making your interface better. I feel like these are some of those important visual design terms that apply. CRAP. If you remember the word CRAP, you'll probably remember these design terms: contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. each one of these design principles are really powerful ones that you can help make information easier to kind of resolve, right? Like, and point out the objective of a screen, right? Like contrast is a very powerful visual tool to get an audience to look at the thing you want them to interact with, right? Like by setting up contrast in either color, value, shape, you can guide someone to look at the object you want them to look at. Repetition, we've already talked about in this talk about how using the same graphic in multiple places and associating it with a particular screen or a particular interaction over and over again can really help that user confidence, as Ryan said. Alignment, just think about a messy bookshelf. Like it's harder to find the book you want when your bookshelf is messy versus when it's lined up and organized, right? So that can really make a big difference in how people perceive the quality of your interface, and make it easier for them to find things. Proximity, by grouping different pieces of visual information together, you can actually change the feeling or meaning behind a screen, right? Like how close I put a countdown timer next to a get button can change the way you perceive that, right? It can change how urgent that action is, right? Just by what you're putting next to each other. So these are the what I think of as some core user experience types of questions and things that we need to think about. So if you can remember the term paper, maybe you can remember these, right? So purpose, association, presentation, empathy, and reliability. These aren't really in order of importance or anything, but if you can think about what the purpose or the objective of that screen or element is, you can ask yourself, what's the point of this screen? Is the purpose of this screen the most important thing on the screen right now? Association, what is this related to? Is this a character related interaction, or is this an environment related interaction? You can start to ask yourself those kinds of questions, which may lead you down another design path. Presentation, again, this falls in line and is directly affected by things like alignment and proximity, contrast. All the craft principles really apply very clearly to presentation. Is everything easy to read, understand? Are the types of information I'm expecting here? Is the objective clear? Right? Like you can change people's perception on how you present the information. Empathy. I think we've been kind of hammering on this one over and over again. How important it is to understand who your audience, who the player really is, right? Like, what is their objective? Why are they, on this screen? Why are they in this game? What are they supposed to be doing? Like, these are all things that we have to consider from moment to moment. And reliability, we've been talking about this over and over. Reliability is built by communicating clearly, repeating types of communication, right? Like repeating shapes and colors and being consistent with their meaning. This type of consistency and repetition is what I feel like builds that user confidence that Ryan's been talking about. Ryan, do you have anything to add to this?
No, I think you've explained it pretty well. I think again, this is reinforcing the idea that at least to me, UI and UX, although can be separate, you should always be thinking about these principles regardless of your domain. Especially if you're a solo UI designer trying to accomplish a great product, you need to internalize these kind of philosophies and ideas. You can always dig in more to certain areas, and you can add the testing side that I've talked about. But like just understanding the complexity of the space, it isn't just pretty things on paper or pretty things in a game. That there is intent behind them, and there's going to be interpretations of them, and understanding who you're designing for. I think this is really powerful principles.
Yeah. So put crap on paper, and you'll have better designs. Yeah. All right. So Ryan, I'm gonna kind of let you drive on this one.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about this. We'll probably kind of blow through here, but I have two kind of metaphors I use when I'm talking about kind of what a UXer's job is, and I'm looking at kind of how do we work within a business. And so I use this reverse relay runner analogy with people all the time, which is basically as a UX person, UX professional, you're kind of running the baton between the various groups, and you just don't let go. You keep taking this to the next group and the next group and the next group, and you're trying to facilitate conversation, communication, and understanding at each one of these stages. So you might start with a game designer that you're running along with, and then you're going to move to the UI designer or the product team, or then you might be moving to engineering to discuss feasibility. But you're constantly working with pretty much every function to act as kind of the linchpin, the central, I won't say owner of knowledge, but like the conveyor of the thing you're trying to build. And so kind of leads into this onion, which is pretty basic metaphor, but like it's the layers of complexity here. As a UX designer, your goal is to progressively reveal more detail over time. You're going to start with a high-level problem that might come from a one-pager, it might come from a game design document, it might come from you, it might come from a product person, it might come from the UI team, who knows? And then you're going to try to translate that into something that is testable. You might build out a prototype, you might sketch, you might do some wireframing in a tool. But your goal at each one of these stages is to get progressively more detail and more alignment and more understanding. And so again, you're running between different groups here, but you're presenting things at different levels of detail and complexity. And ultimately, you're going to be delivering a deliverable of some sort that's going to be immensely detailed with every edge case defined. You're going to be looking at how to capture failure states, purchase flow, validation, all these things. You're going to go into excruciating detail, but you're going to do that after you've had all these smaller conversations, after you've built up to this confidence, after you've tested, after you've discussed this with people. So these are the two general philosophies of UX that I like to look at it as the day-to-day of our job is communication and progressively revealing detail at the appropriate times to the appropriate people.
Yeah, like I often felt like I was in the middle of like sitting in the eye of a storm. In a lot of ways, like you're there for every part of the production, and at any given stage, somebody is looking for something from you.
Yeah, and ideally, you have a way to help them, get some more confidence. You're going to build that confidence with them,
which actually can make the UI UX person on a team, or if it is split, as we've done, they actually have a lot of control over how that game is going to turn out. I would think, right?
Yeah, I mean, done right, a lot of direct impact, but ultimately, I would look at it as like they have a lot of, I guess, impact. And I guess it is control, but it's like you're really trying to facilitate everyone's vision and your players' needs, and you might be the one kind of putting pen to paper on this, but you're interpreting the data, you're looking at the user interviews, you're translating the game designer's goals and the product goals, and so yeah, there is a lot of ownership, but it ultimately should be a distributed thing.
Right.
That the team is bought into this together, and that you're working together to accomplish this, and you're just a facilitator of that in a lot of ways.
Right.
It's kind of, I think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, like the way I've explained it is that it's very much a support role, right? Like not necessarily the star of the show, but we're there to make the star brighter, right? Like,
Yeah, I think so. And I think how we accomplish that is on the next slide. This is a very typical UX process. You can find this, type in UX process, you find something relatively similar. But this works very well in games. Now, finding the time to do this can be difficult. This is not a roadmap. This is not a recipe. You are going to
like
skip steps. Yeah, but this is the thought process that you want to internalize, which is there are phases of thinking, and you're going to be working through them in an iterative fashion. So although this one doesn't actually show going back to the discovery, you are constantly going back to the beginning here. You're going to jump around based on where you are, what you've illuminated. You're always going to be testing your assumptions and validating them or throwing them away. And in that way, it's kind of the scientific process. So you're never want to get too wedded to any one direction, one solution, because you ultimately aren't the owner of that. Your players are, and they're going to tell you if this works or not. Your KPIs are going to tell you if it worked or not. And so you want to get that level of confidence as early as possible. So the phases are just broadly, discovery, definition. This ideation, prototyping, testing phase is where most people think of as UX. This is where you're going to be sketching and wireframing. Build is when you're getting to the code phase, and then measuring is that KPI release portion. So, discovery, you can do things like competitive analysis. You can grab a game that's already out there, put it in your lab, put it in your team's hands, have people sit down and discuss what is great about this, what's bad, what do they like, what do they want to capture. You could bring in users that play this game.
So would you say that, sorry,
Sure.
This just popped something in my head, but would you say that the discovery and definition part is if you're running that relay race with your team, that's where you're talking to product and game design?
For sure, you're intimately talking to them there. You're going to be doing that as well, heavily through the ideation and prototyping and testing phase. But yeah, you're collaborating hand in hand at this point. Often that core idea is going to come down from the product team or coming down from the game design group. So you're going to be working through them. And my goal here is how can I help them understand the problem they're solving? So can we give them analyses? Can we help them understand our players better? Can we give them an empathy map that will help define some of the complexity here of the kind of players' empathetic journey between using this product? Can you interview people to help them understand who their users are better? Definition phase is getting to a little more detail again. Can you map that journey that you're expecting them to go through? Can you define that user flow? Can you create an IA map? So again, all these tools, and this is not exhaustive by any stretch, they're just there to help facilitate conversation and communication. Ultimately, you're going to get to a point of documentation, which is in this ideation and prototype and test phase. There's no number here. There's no like, oh, you do one round of this and you're done. You might do none. You might just design something and your team goes, we got to put this in. That kind of sucks, but that's the reality of game development. You're going to be very, very fluid here, but you're always going to be trying to get more confidence. So can you build out a prototype just to test with your internal team? Can you build out a prototype to test with external players? Can you get something more complex with maybe collaboration with UI, where you can pull in a fully functional UI complete quote unquote prototype that will feel like a build but has no code? You're always looking to peel that onion back and to get more confidence, to get more detail. And so ultimately in the build here, you're going to be trying to work with engineers in art. You're going to be communicating feedback to them on UX goals. You're going to be helping them validate the art, maybe with research teams, maybe with other measures. You're going to be reviewing them with playtests with your internal team. And ultimately, you're going to be supporting engineering because they might come back to you. Hopefully, you validated this earlier. They might come back to you and go, well, that design, that interaction you wanted, that's going to take us 9 days to implement. We just don't have the time. So can we come up with a solution that is a compromise that's more feasible within the architecture we have or within the constraints we have? And you're going to have to compromise. And again, going back to that triangle concept, you might have had this amazingly usable solution, but guess what? It's 2 weeks of time and you don't have it, so you're not going to do it.
Right.
And then ultimately, you're going to be looking at how do you analyze this for success and how do you look at improving it in the future. And there's a dozen ways to do this. Surveys are a fantastic tool. Release analysis around KPIs, again, like we were talking about, looking at how your players are interacting with it from a data perspective, are really cheap and easy ways to get feedback quickly. And then kind of ultimately, there's this on the next slide, this quote from Don Norman and Jacob Nielsen, which is, we've touched on this a lot today. Like, user experience encompasses all aspects of the end user's interaction with the company, its services, and its products. But what I want to highlight here is that doesn't mean that a user experience designer owns that. Like, this to me highlights the fact that we're all going to impact the UX, the perceived UX, whatever it is of this thing. And so it's really a team mentality that needs to be built and fostered through kind of co-ownership of all of this. Yes, the UX designer or UI UX person, or whoever it is, will own the kind of deliverable portion of this, and they'll be driving a lot of the day-to-day processes. But you really want to be an evangelist for the process to your team and to the value of it, and be able to communicate that so that they become owners with you, and you don't have to convince them that a test is worth doing, or convince them that iterating is valuable, or whatever it is. But get everyone to become owners with you is the ultimate kind of business goal of UX, because then you can make amazing products together. You can make amazing games because you're going to budget time into your production schedule to test things. You're going to do more diligence around the design portion. So yeah, I just always like to highlight that, it's not about you as a UX person being the big decider. That's really almost the opposite. You're the facilitator, and you're a support person, like Greg was saying, to so many other people. And your number one skill is that communication side. Can you illuminate this problem space and help resolve it? And you've got a toolkit to use in UX to get there. And there's never a template or one solution that's necessarily going to work for everything. So you're going to be flexible. You're going to be agile. You're going to be hopefully hungry to get to the root of it. You're going to be a problem solver.
Yeah, that's a key term, problem solve, right? Because we're not there to dictate how every step or interaction or thing really should function and look. We are there to kind of show what possible solutions there are and try to decide as a team like which direction to go. Because like I've said before, like you can't effectively build this on your own. I mean, yes, you could build something that will work. You'll understand it as the creator much better than anyone else, but until you get your product in front of an audience and gain that feedback, or in front of your teammates and gain the feedback, you're best guessing. Yeah, I think it's just super important to be considerate of who your audience is and who you're working with.
Yeah, I've got a question for both of you guys, because since we're talking from a university standpoint, we're talking from somebody looking for a job, we're somebody thinking about getting into this industry. We haven't talked about any kind of goblins or ghosts or dragons or anything like that at all, which it makes total sense because this is a different aspect of it. But what are some of those maybe backgrounds or majors or mindsets that people have who, when you go, maybe I want to hire somebody, or somebody who goes, hey, I'm really interested in this field. I like video games, but I'm a psychology major. Can I do this? Is there some of those soft skills or education paths that really dovetail well into this world of UI and UX?
I can talk from the UX side. I mean, you nailed it. Psychology is 100%. Now, you might end up more on the research side of things, and we do, I talk a lot about research today, but that's actually often a separate discipline, which is a UX researcher from a UX designer. Sometimes you have a jack of all trades UX role. When Greg and I worked together, that was mostly what I was doing at the time, was just a one-man kind of UX portion of things on the projects.
Yeah, similar.
Yeah. So psychology for sure. HCI, human computer interaction, is the classic background for UX. That being said, there's a number of new programs coming out. I mean, you guys have a actual UX program, UI UX program. I've seen just pure UX, kind of the psychology and data side programs come up at Berkeley and all over the place. I think all those are great. I would never discourage someone from doing it, especially if you're interested. That being said, from an interviewing standpoint, I don't typically look too much at education because for UX designers, at least, a lot of it has to do with kind of ambition, problem solving, the way that they look at creating solutions. And ultimately, I mean, this is not a great answer and no one wants to hear it, but your portfolio is paramount. I want to see the ability to demonstrate solutions and a process to get to those solutions in your portfolio. And so that being said, the game side does have a little caveat, which you kind of do need to enjoy games. It's not 100%. I've had designers who are fantastic that aren't huge gamers or anything. We don't interview it explicitly, but it does help to have a passion because you're going to want to get immersed in the products that are out there. You're going to want to understand the paradigms that our players are expecting. Because going back to Gary's point, like you don't want to break kind of repetition between products necessarily. Even you're going to want to build that confidence of like, okay, I know that when I see a red indicator on an enemy, or a red indicator on a character, that's probably an enemy. And a health bar generally looks like this. Like you can reinvent those, but do you want to? Do you want to reteach those? If you minimize the amount you're trying to teach your player, you can focus on what's maybe novel and unique about your product. There is a great benefit to having that background. That being said, again, it's like you're not your user, so I don't expect you to be the number one player of that genre. I expect you to go out and discover that. But it is really valuable to have that passion. And games studios have people that are like-mindedly passionate, and so that's what's so fun. And honestly, what's a little frustrating about COVID from a day-to-day standpoint is like you're with people that you generally legitimately have a lot in common with, and so you have that passion for games. You guys enjoy playing Smash Bros. You've enjoyed X, Y, and Z, and it builds that kind of level of camaraderie. And again, not required, but it is nice.
Yeah. So communicating with other people, you have to have some of those soft skills with interacting with other people a bit, right?
Yeah. And I think honestly, from an interviewing perspective, like soft skills are almost the number one thing because you probably won't get in the door without some sort of portfolio that shows, you can use Sketch. Great. That's a necessity. You need to be able to use a prototyping tool of some sort or a wireframing tool. And if you're past that point of a review in the portfolio, what I want to see is, can you communicate to me? Can you tell me why you made these decisions? Can you inform me of the conversations that you had and the ways you tried to get alignment, the ways you tried to compromise? What was your process to get here? That's so important, and your ability to articulate that to me is really important.
I mean, the other question that comes up to me, and I know it's probably a loaded question, but quickly kind of wrap it all up. If somebody wants to start doing UI UX, other than of course come to the Academy of Art or interviewing, how does somebody get started in UI and or UX?
I can hop on the UX one again. It's still especially in games, a relatively young field, which is good and bad, I think, but probably mostly good for young people because we're not really looking, again, like I was saying, towards the academic backgrounds necessarily. It's happening. There are probably some companies that do. I personally just am not hiring explicitly for that. But because of that, you can start with a lot of books, and there's great webinars now out there. You could watch things like this and start getting foundations. There's if you just type in UX book recommendations on Google, you'll get probably the same list every time. And it's because it's a just foundational group of 5 or so books that will teach you, honestly, enough to get started and understand it, because you won't fully grasp the kind of process-driven aspect of UX until you're in the weeds and having a chance to do it. And so then take it upon yourself to start looking at problems in things. What do you think is an issue in X game or Y product or whatever, and start defining how would you solve that, because you can make your own case studies that are super valuable in a portfolio and demonstrate that.
I'm just going to jump in on this real quick. Like this, what Ryan's talking about, like making case studies and the researching aspect, that is easily one of the best like things that you can do to start on your own journey to understanding this is take, and I have my students do this. Take a game that you really like playing, like it could be a mobile game, it could be PC or console game, whatever game, and what I have my students do is start reverse engineering the flow, right? So you can literally sit down with your controller or your phone and just start counting the steps from starting the game to that first like playable screen. You can literally like count the steps of how you got there, and build out a flow chart for how this game is put together. Essentially, it's a super valuable way to analyze um, how a game is working, and it's one of the simplest ways to kind of see how you can eliminate steps or make something potentially easier, or find screens that don't link up, that maybe there it would benefit to have another button to get to the options screen from your pause menu. There's it's a really great way to just start getting into it.
All right. Well, I think that's about all we can cover in this short amount of time. But all right, Greg, Ryan, thank you guys very much. And for more information, I know Afro Comic Con's got a lot of great resources, and Academy of Art's got great resources. And just reach out to everybody and see where your career in UI and UX can go.